Welcome to your Introduction to Ethics course. This is your video for Unit 1, Embracing Ethics. In this unit, we are going to try to give a few definitions. First, we'll try to understand what ethics, ethical behavior, and ethical thinking are. We'll start with what is ethics. What exactly do we mean by ethics? Then, we'll move to ethical thinking. What is it to think ethically? We'll take some time to think about the various ways in which many people avoid thinking and behaving ethically, and those are the ethics avoidance disorders. And finally, we'll take a stab at the question of how to take values seriously, moral values in this case. So what does it take to behave ethically? Does it take to feed the hungry? Or does it take to lead protests against violation of civil rights? Or maybe it is to stand up against gun violence. Or maybe it is to clean up your parks and clean up the rivers. Here's a definition that Weston gives in your textbook. He says that to think and act ethically is to take care for the basic needs and legitimate expectations of others as well as our own. Now that definition requires a little bit more thinking. What does he mean by taking care? Well, to take care requires that we inquire into what we take care of, that we are being conscientious about that thing, and then we sustain and further that thing we take care of. And those are the three meanings in which Weston understands the notion of taking care for. Think about it. If you were to be taking care of something, someone, or let's say your friend's pet, well, first you would like to inquire into what her needs are and and what is important to her. You would want to be conscientious about furthering and sustaining those needs and expectations. That sounds pretty right. Now, Weston tells us that to act and behave ethically, we have to take care for their basic needs and legitimate expectations of others. But who are the others? Do animals count as others? Or do people we disagree with count as others? Those are important questions that arise in the light of this definition. More question arises when you think about what it means to take care for basic needs and legitimate expectations. Let's start with basic needs. What are basic needs? Is it to have enough food, or is it having choices about what to eat? Does education or healthcare count as basic needs? Things get even trickier when we think about what legitimate expectations are. Are we talking about equal rights? Or are we counting equal wealth as being legitimate expectations? Well, obviously, those are open questions at this point. More importantly, these are ethical questions. That is, they are exactly the kind of questions that we're going to ask in this course. About whom should we care? Who deserves ethical consideration? What rights should we have? What is the right way to act? How do I live a good life? How do I take care of others and myself? Now you might be thinking, well, do these questions have any answers at all? Isn't it the case that everybody disagrees on those issues? That's probably true. And sure, there is no single easy answer for those questions. But what philosophy and ethics can do for you is to help you figure out that there are better or worse answers. And to evaluate that, what we do is that we look into the reasons that lie behind those answers, we evaluate those reasons, and then we give reasons for believing that one answer is better or worse than another. And this is basically what ethical thinking is about. Ethical thinking is precisely about looking at various answers and to be able to evaluate those answers by looking into the reasons that are behind those answers. Let me say that ethical thinking is hard. It is hard especially because it requires that we think anew some of our most fundamental and favored ethical views. Now, ethical thinking can be characterized by three aspects: the fact that it is systematic, critical, and creative. Let me say more about that. First, ethical thinking is systematic. That is, it looks at the various answers that are proposed. It looks into the reasons that lie behind those answers, and also it looks into the consequences of those answers. In order to think ethically, you also need to think critically. And thinking critically means that you have to be open to criticism. It may well be the case that you'll have to rethink, potentially abandon some of your most favored views in ethics. It also requires that you are responsive to facts. That is really important. If the facts disagree with your beliefs, then you just have to change your beliefs. Finally, you have to be responsive to reasons and arguments. Arguments not in the sense of dispute, but in logical arguments, the sense of logical arguments. If someone shows that you are just mistaken, you have to be responsive to that argument. Last bit, ethical thinking must be creative. It is not to think ethically, to just combat your opponents and get stuck in a deadlock. What you need to do is to get out of deadlocks. To do that, you need to think outside of the box and also to look for common ground. This is hard again. This is not an easy feat, but it is truly rewarding. By thinking systematically, critically, and creatively, ethical thinking avoids going into your average fruitless debate, and instead promotes respectful and productive discussions. So we try to understand what it means to act and think ethically. Let's proceed now by contrast. What does it take to not act ethically, to not behave ethically, to not think ethically? What do people do to avoid hard ethical thinking? Well, there are several ethics avoidance disorders, as Weston calls them, and he distinguishes between flying by instinct, dogmatism, egoism, and relativism, and we'll cover that quickly. Interestingly, we can understand those ethics avoidance disorders as conflating two things that are really distinct. The distinction I want to make here is between the descriptive and the prescriptive. A description is when you explain the way things are. A prescription is when you explain the way things should be. Now, the descriptives and the prescriptives are not always the same, and just because things are a certain way, it doesn't follow that they ought to be that way. To give you this example, and we'll go back to it, think about someone who says, well, people are selfish. That is a descriptive claim. It's just a claim about what people are. Now, from this, it doesn't follow that people should be selfish or ought to be selfish. That would be a prescriptive claim. That is a prescription for the kind of things that we ought to be doing. Interestingly, this is one way in which you can understand many of the ethics avoidance disorders that Weston is talking about. Take flying by instinct, for example. It is possible to understand that avoidance of ethics as a conflation between the descriptive and the prescriptive. On the descriptive side, someone can say, this is the way I feel. And that's always true. There is no way denying this. Now, from this, it doesn't follow this is the way this person should feel or ought to feel. That would be on the prescriptive side. Someone who says that his instinct is or her instincts are always the way to go conflates the descriptive and the prescriptive. Feelings are always true, but they are not always justified, and we don't always want to act on them. You can think about dogmatism in the same way. On the descriptive side, someone can say, this is what I believe, and that might be well true. It might be well true that that is what he or she believes, and that belief is strongly held. Now, from that, it doesn't follow that this is what he or she ought to believe. That is, from the descriptive claim, it doesn't follow that there is a prescription to believe the way he does. No matter how strong your belief is, this is not a justification in itself. Think again about egoism. We talked about it. Egoism is again a conflation between the prescriptive and the descriptive. On the descriptive side, sure, people are sometimes selfish. But from this, it doesn't follow that people ought to be selfish. Again, to pretend that this follows from this is just a mistake, a logical mistake. Relativism, that is the view according to which all views are equally valid, all moral views are equally valid, also follows the same pattern. On the descriptive side, the relativist says, well, look, people disagree. And again, that may well be true. But from that simple fact, it doesn't follow that people ought to disagree about everything. It doesn't follow that all opinions are equally valid. It doesn't follow that there is no common ground, or that there are not answers that are better than others. So we talked about the ethics avoidance disorders, the various ways in which we can avoid ethics. We've seen that most of those disorders, most of those ways of avoiding thinking ethically, can be understood as conflating the prescriptive with the descriptive. That is, to take some description of how people behave as a prescription of how they ought to behave. So if the way people behave is not the way necessarily they ought to behave, how do we figure out how to behave? This brings us to the last part of this week's material, which is about taking values seriously. So how do we take values seriously? How do we prescribe ourselves a better life than what just is? Well, Wellstone helps you figure this out. First, we'll talk briefly about what values are. Then we'll talk about families of values. And then finally, we'll turn to the ways in which we should be attending to values. So what are values? Well, Weston says that values are those things we care about that matter to us, those goals and ideas we aspire to and measure ourselves and our others or our society by. This is a general description. We all understand what it means. Look at that list: openness, respect, teamwork, honesty. All of these are examples of values, those ideas, those goals, those norms that we hope to achieve, we hope to foster, and that we expect others to foster as well. This can be overwhelming. There are so many values involved, it is not clear which values are supposed to play a role and which are not. One way to think about this is to think in terms of families of values. Weston explains to you that values come in families. The family of persons around the values around the notion of persons, the one around the notion of virtue, the one around the notion of happiness, and the one around the notion of relationships. We'll go back to all of those families. In fact, we'll spend an entire unit looking at each of those families, one after the other. So this is your introduction to those families. When you think in terms of person, you think in terms of rights and respect for those rights. When you think in terms of virtue, you think in terms of character and the kind of virtuous person you want to be. When you think in terms of happiness, you think about how you can increase happiness and diminish suffering. Often involves utility calculations. When you think about relationship, you think about the kind of community, your families, your friends, the earth, possibly, the kind of communities you are involved with or committed to, and the responsibility that come with being part of those communities. Thinking in terms of families of values is very useful. In fact, what you can realize is that thinking in terms of families helps you mapping out issues. You'll find out, if you practice, that oftentimes what seems to be conflicting views about an issue are really views that come with different from the point of view of different families. Each of the four families of ethical values asks us to look at situations differently. It's like putting on different color glasses. To give you a brief example, think about whether you should tell your best friend that her partner is cheating on her or him. Well, from the point of view of the ethics of persons, if you have respect for your friend, then you probably ought to say to tell the truth. But from the point of view of happiness, it is not clear that more happiness will come out of you telling the truth than not. There are some systematic ways in which families of ethical values see situations differently. And so mapping out issues in that way helps you understand how different conflicting views can come out of perfectly natural, even if conflicting, point of view about ethics. So one goal we have for this course is precisely to map out issues in terms of families of ethical values. We will want to attend to all the values that are involved, or all the families of values involved. We will want to welcome diversity. We will want to understand that many values are going to be involved in the most common issues, and that's a good thing. We will want to look in depth. We will not want to remain superficial, but understand instead that there are several layers of thinking and analyzing that need to be attended to. While doing this, we will want to suspend our judgment. So that we don't rush to judgment, but instead try to understand the many sides that can be seen in one particular issue. Then we will want to clarify the situation by making distinctions. Just saying, oh, it's just too complicated is not going to be good enough. We will want to clarify the situation, to map out the situation, to have a better understanding of the options, what the reasons are for thinking in terms of in the thinking the way different people think, and so having a better understanding of the overall situation. Finally, we will want to give emotion its due. Sure, ethics is not only a matter of feelings and emotions, but it's part of it, and we always want to remain respectful of other people's emotions, even if emotions is not the last word or justification for much of anything. All of this are the rules by which we want to play the game that we agreed to play in this course, which is to attend to value in a serious and mature way. Now let me proceed to the conclusion. In this course, we will be asking hard, difficult questions and painful questions, and also questions on which many of us have very strong opinions. We will be open to various answers, but we will also look at those various answers by doing some hard thinking, looking at the reasons behind the consequence ahead, and looking at the different ways in which we can understand and map out those different answers as coming from different ethical points of view. On the basis of that evaluation, of that hard thinking, what we want to draw is a map of the very careful answers we can give to very difficult questions. And we want also to evaluate those various answers. At the end of the day, I will not yet want to send you home with one single easy answer to those difficult questions. But I want you to go home with a better understanding of the various possible answers and why those answers are more or less ethically grounded. Now, a little word about the various discussions we'll have over the week. The first day, today, the discussion is really about introducing ourselves to each other and the kind of expectations that we have for the course. On the second day, I want you to think seriously about ethical transformation. What does it take to change your mind on the ethical issues on which you were pretty set for a long time? On the third day, I want you to think about value identification. We'll talk about gay marriage, but in an interesting and probably original way. That is, Sullivan's defense of gay marriage from a conservative point of view. The game will be here there to understand how conservative values can be played out in order to defend gay marriage. It will not be about whether you agree with gay marriage or not. It will be about trying to understand how we can defend gay marriage from a conservative point of view. Finally, on Friday, we'll spend some time on food choices and we'll discuss the treatment of animals. Again, the point will not be to come home with a clear-cut answer about how you should eat, but more about how to understand the kinds of reasons and facts and arguments that are behind various positions. That's all for today. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope we have a good week together.